Hello, thank you for joining us. I'm Trent Brown. I'm an associate professor here at Tokyo College, and it's my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Michael Keane, who's our Ushioda Fellow here at Tokyo College. So Michael is an economist who served as Deputy Director of Fiscal Affairs at the International Monetary Fund, where he was based for over 20 years. During that time, he shaped the IMF's policies and advice in relation to fiscal affairs, in response to his area of expertise, which is taxation policy. Before that, he was Professor of Economics at the University of Essex. So Michael has given several talks for us here at Tokyo College in the past. Last year, we sat here for a discussion of the EU's border carbon adjustment policy, which is somewhat related to today's topic. Interested viewers can find that talk on our YouTube channel. Today, Michael will be talking to us about the potential of taxation policy in addressing a host of environmental problems in countries with developing economies. The talk draws on his recent book, Taxation and the Environment, an overview of key issues for developing countries. The book's available freely online in PDF form at the website of the French Research Institute, the Foundation for Studies and Research on International Development, or FERDI, F-E-R-D-I, so you can look that up on their website. Also joining us today is Professor SAWADA Yasuyuki, who is professor in the Faculty of Economics here at the University of Tokyo. And before I hand it over to Michael, I'd like to apologize that today's talk will only be available in English. We do hope that we can make a Japanese version available on our YouTube channel in the near future. I'd also like to say that at any point throughout today's presentation, you are free to submit your questions to the speakers using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And we'll go through some of those questions later on. Okay, so without further ado, I'll hand it over to Michael.
Thank you very much, Trent. So I hope I'm showing my screen okay. So thank you very much, Trent, for the kind introduction. Thank you, Professor Sawada, for coming along today, and thanks everyone for joining. Yes, so well, without much further ado, Trent's introduced the topic. So let me just set out what I'm going to be talking about. One second. Oh, yeah, there we go. So, as Trent says, this talk is based on a book, which, as you kindly mentioned, is free for download, English and French. For context, this was work that was asked for by the Ministry of European and Foreign Affairs in France, who, in the context of their development work, I think were interested in the intersection of two issues that were troubling them. One was a set of environmental issues. They knew there were big environmental problems in many of their countries they worked in. And the other was the public finance challenge, essentially what's sometimes called domestic revenue mobilization, the need for more revenue in many low-income countries. And I think they were kind of interested in how these two areas intersect. I think they perceived that it's less true now than a few years ago, that kind of environmental people were very keen on using tax instruments, whereas the kind of public finance tax people were a little really kind of focused on other things, weren't so kind of involved in those issues. So I think they wanted to sort out what's going on at the intersection. So me as a kind of, I'm a tax guy, I'm a public finance guy, I'm not an environment guy. So I think my role was to kind of bring us a kind of a hard-nosed public finance perspective to think about some of these environmental issues. So that's the context. So what I'm going to talk about in 45 minutes or so, first of all, we'll take stock of, well, what actually are these environmental problems that we're talking about in low-income countries? What might the role be in general for environmental taxes? What are the kind of principles that we might bring to bear when we try to identify constructive roles for taxation and addressing these issues? Going back to developing countries, well, what's kind of different about developing countries? Why are the issues about environmental taxation any different in low-income countries compared to advanced economies? Then I'll say just a little bit about some of the politics of what's going on, and what we need to be kind of considerate of in this area. And then at the end, I'll just go through more or less sequentially a series of topics that the book looks at in more detail. and try to reduce, for each of those, reduce them to a kind of a bullet point set of conclusions that we can perhaps then discuss. So that's the program. And as I say, let me then begin by just taking a brief overview of what we think the problems are in low-income countries. So what these two charts do is they report numbers from something called the Environmental Performance Index, EPI, which is run out of Yale. And what this does is essentially for all the countries in the world, under, I think, 11 headings, it, in a fairly analytical way, I mean, a well-defined way, gives scores, 100 being the best, 0 being the worst, in 11, I think it's 11 environmental areas. So these are things like air quality, biodiversity, acidification, forestry, all these kind of areas, waste management. So you get a score out of 100 in each of these areas. And what these two little figures do is essentially report an aggregate of these numbers, no particular weighting, just take it across the 11 and figure out what the average score is. So what you see on the right is these are the scores grouped by the income level of the country. So the kind of the green area, you see, that basically means that 50% of the countries are in that little range. And then the kind of the bars going up gives you a sense of the highest and the lowest that you find. So you see both the central tendency in the green area and the kind of range in the height of those little bars. So you can see that high-income countries are doing best, not doing brilliantly, by the way. I mean, they're still under the mean is which is the bar in the middle of the green bar is still below 60, but nonetheless they're doing better than the other income groups. And then at the right end, you see the group that is of probably of most interest for us today, which is the low income. And clearly they're not doing so well. They're not doing that much worse, incidentally, than some of the lower middle income countries. You can see too, there's a bit of a spread in terms of the scores. So there's diversity in what's going on in the low income countries. But the mean you can see is kind of around about 35, which numbers may not mean all that much, but you can see that certainly the low incomes are performing least well. Although, as you can see, some of the lower middle income countries are doing even worse. So it's not kind of necessarily clear cut in relation to income. That may be something we come back to. That's something economists have thought quite a lot about, is how environmental degradation relates to income levels. So that's the that's the left-hand chart, giving you impression across countries at different income levels. On the right, is essentially a little heat map, and this is primarily for sub-Saharan Africa. I should say the work in the book was largely focused on Francophone Africa, of course, particular interest of the French. And again, you can see this essentially shows some diversity across countries. The deeper the red, the worse the situation is. But you can see, and again, from both charts, you can see the situation is not great, varies across countries, and in some contexts, it's really rather troubling. So let's maybe make some, at least a number of observations that come out of this. One point I wanted that's very central to the book is that when you think about environmental issues for developing countries, it's about much more than climate change. I think we're so used to thinking about climate change as the kind of paramount environmental issue. We should remember that when it comes to developing countries, I mean, two things are true. One is that they're going to suffer more as a result of climate change. We know that all the changes in weather patterns, migration implications, sea level rise, all these things are going to be more damaging for low-income countries. We've known that for decades. So, for example, I think the evidence is that if you have even a 1 degree centigrade increase in temperature for 1 year, 7 or so years later, per capita income is still like 1 percentage point lower as a result. So this is in terms of suffering, this is really a low-income country issue. However, the second thing to remember is that they can't really make that much difference to the problem. That is, in terms of mitigation, reducing climate change, the low-income countries are not the important players. We think again about sub-Saharan Africa. order of magnitude is at about 7% of the stock of greenhouse gas emissions from which climate change is coming. About 7% goes back to sub-Saharan African countries, and similarly, about the same proportion of the flow of greenhouse gases comes from low-income countries. So in terms of reducing climate change, this isn't really primarily a concern for low-income countries. In terms of the impact, it clearly is. But in terms of tax policy measures that countries can take themselves, it means we should avoid trying to overestimate climate change and mitigation measures as critical. So we want to focus on areas really where their fate is in their own hands to some extent, in the sense that developing countries can take actions to mitigate the harm that they suffer. A couple of other observations. There's a lot of variation in the severity of each problem across countries and of problems within countries. So if you take fisheries, for example, fisheries, I think Togo scores about 6, which is very bad. Cape Verde actually gets 100. So importance of fisheries varies quite a lot. And even within countries, there's a lot of variation across the categories. So the example I give is Niger. Acidification, 66, maybe not so bad. On the other hand, solid waste management is a big issue down there at 6. What also certainly struck me, taking stock of these numbers, is that many of the most pressing environmental problems are ones that actually tax people, public finance people haven't thought much. So if you look at beyond the diversity to say, what are the issues that really are quite often at the top of the list in terms of the damage, they are things like waste management, provision of clean water, use of agrochemicals, fisheries, which are not issues that tax people have really paid as much attention to as you might think. I think there's a question as to why that is. Part of it is simply, I think it's not a great research topic because it's hard to get good information. But I think one could also ask, well, is it really because so much interest, so much kind of academic work and policy focus has been driven by the interests of the richer countries? But that's mere speculation. So that's the background. Let's move on a little bit to say, well, why might environmental taxes be a sensible thing here? Well, need to go through a little bit of a story, a little bit of some economics here. So let's suppose there is some kind of harmful emission going on, which is in the bottom of this picture. So as we move to the right, harmful emissions are going up. This could be emissions of whatever, it could be reductions in air quality, but let's say it could be somebody turning their radio up loud. This could be me turning my radio up loud. So the emission is the noise. As the noise goes up, that really irritates you. So the story is that as we move to the right, I gain from putting my radio louder. What the blue line shows is not my total gain, but how much I gain from the last bit of emission, the last bit of making my radio just a little bit louder. And we typically assume that goes down. So we start at 0 on the left, putting on a bit of volume is really useful for me. As I increase the volume, well, a little bit more volume is less useful until at the end I reach B, and this is as loud as I can possibly want it to be. On the other hand, the story is you're suffering from the emission, and the suffering you have from a little bit more of the emission, a little bit more noise, increases. So the first bit of volume doesn't cause you much problem. The last bit is really, really irritating. So it's a kind of standard form of an environmental externality, what comments call an externality. What's the situation going to be? Well, suppose I can turn my radio up as loud as I can. I don't have to worry about you. Then I'm going to go to point B, where it's as loud as I can possibly want it. That's really irritating for you. Your harm, given by the green line, is clearly much better than my gain from the last bit of noise. So what's going to happen? Well, one story is that maybe you're going to come along to me and you're going to bribe me. You're basically going to bargain with me to turn my radio down. And you can see that you could offer a small amount at B, you could offer a small amount that is more attractive to me than turning my radio up, and essentially is less, you value that loss of money less than you value the reduction in volume. So you can bribe me to to turn the radio down, so long as your pain exceeds my gain at the margin. We're going to end up at A. That bargaining leads you to A, and that's what economists would call an efficient solution, because essentially my marginal pain, my marginal benefit is equal to your marginal pain. There's no other level that can make us both better off. So bargaining gets us to a nice solution. Trouble is, of course, many of the kind of environmental problems, we can't really imagine bargaining. So how else might we do it? What are the other kind of policy approaches? One is simply regulation. Regulation here would simply tell me when I turn my radio up, you are not allowed to turn your radio any louder than A, that point that we said is the efficient one. Fine, that's great. We're both, we kind of reach the efficient allocation. Another, so that's the regulation. You could have litigation. You could take me to court. Let's leave that aside. The tax solution says, yeah, you can turn your radio up as loud as you want, but you're going to have to pay a tax that increases with volume. And that's this amount T, the level T. So you can see that starting from 0.0, how much am I going to, how loud am I going to turn my radio up? I'm going to turn it up until my gain from turning it up a bit more is just equal to the tax I have to pay. So I'm going to end up at A. So the tax situation is getting me to it's getting us to point A. So regulation and bargaining seem to both get us to a nice outcome. But there's an important difference, which is that when we go through the tax route, I'm actually going to be paying some money. I'm going to be paying this amount T times the amount A, the amount I emit. So I may actually end up worse off as a result of this tax. There's no guarantee that I'm going to be better off than I was in the absence of a tax. So if we're both to gain from this tax, from this policy intervention, the person who's paying the tax has to be compensated. Otherwise, they may lose out. So the prescription that says we can try to make both people better off as a result of dealing with this externality, this environmental problem. If we do it by a tax, we have to think about compensating the people who are paying the tax. Otherwise, some people are getting worse off, some people are getting better off. Maybe on aggregate, they're getting collectively better off. But if we want everybody to gain, we're going to have to think about compensating the losers. And I'll come back to that. Now you can compare these instruments more explicitly, which we do in the book. I'm not going to go through this table, but let me just make a couple of points. Clearly, taxation, comparing tax and regulation, taxation is better than regulation if you want some money. If the government wants money, taxation gives you money, regulation doesn't. If you look at the third kind of row, well, suppose that there are what we might call tipping points, irreversibilities. That is, suppose that the emissions, if they go above some level, there's going to be a real disaster. It could be the melting of the Antarctic ice sheet, or it could be a biodiversity loss. In that case, you might say regulation is better. So the general point I want to make here is that different instruments have different merits. And in general, you probably want to use more than one instrument to achieve environmental objectives, which again is so tax may not be the best response. It's often better when the pollutant is kind of clear, well-defined, and you can charge it what's called by economists upstream. So if there are just a few sellers of this product, that makes it easy to tax, and then taxation may be a good way to go, essentially on pragmatic administrative grounds. Let's then go back to developing countries as well. Okay, so we've looked at what their problems are environmentally. We've looked at what the role of the taxes might be in principle. What actually is different in developing countries? Well, a few things. One is they need revenue. There's a kind of a folk wisdom that sustainable growth, which is based on some empirical evidence, the folk wisdom is that roughly you have to have a ratio of taxation to GDP of about 15% for growth to become sustainable and lasting. Many of the countries we're talking about do not have tax GDP ratios of 15%. So they have a dire need for revenue. Moreover, if you think about sustainable development goals, some of the estimates are that to achieve the sustainable development goals, low-income countries need another 15% of GDP. So there's a dire need for revenue. I'll maybe come back to that, to the second point in the bullet later. They're often administratively challenged, of course, in low-income countries. Administration is often weak, particularly tax administration can be quite challenged. And those challenges can be especially great when we think about lower-level government and local government. And since many of the challenges that we might think about, waste management, water, things like solid waste management, are largely local problems, that's going to be a bit of an issue if the local government doesn't have much capacity to deal with it. So what else is different? Well, clearly many of the environmental problems we're talking about affect extremely vulnerable people. If we think about agricultural related environmental issues, 2/3 of the world's poorest families have somebody involved in agriculture. We know if we just think about city life, we know that all the problems tend to accrue most adversely in the parts of town where poor people live. We think about compensation, which I've sort of stressed as being key. We don't necessarily have many instruments by which we can make direct transfers to people to compensate them for increases in tax levels. I think importantly that's changing. It's changed quite a lot in COVID. Many developing countries have got much better in delivering cash benefits to vulnerable parts of the population. Again, there's some examples in the book. But for example, in Togo, with help from actually a bunch of American academics, they managed to reach about 500,000 people in a very short period of time, like something like 2 or 3 weeks, with cash payments when the COVID epidemic struck, which is better than many higher income countries achieved. So there's a long way to go, but there is certainly some hope there, including things like mobile money, use of biometric identifiers. So you can basically target at least to people with some degree of confidence. There are often environmental subsidies to think about in low-income countries. This is not just in relation to fuel, the most commonly discussed aspect, but for example, fertilizers and pesticides. So if we're thinking about we might want to tax something, the first thing you want to do, of course, is eliminate subsidies. And maybe just a bit of a spoiler alert, when we think about the additional revenue from the kind of taxes we're going to be talking about, we're not going to be transforming the fiscal circumstances of low-income countries. A big ticket item, as we'll see, is going to be coming from fuel taxes, which might give you 1.5% of GDP in sub-Saharan Africa, which is kind of certainly worthwhile when your tax ratio is less than 15%, but it's far from solving all the problems you might want to solve in terms of domestic revenue mobilization. So let's say a little bit about some of the politics of achieving environmental tax reform. I think I've already stressed, but let me say it again, is that this whole issue of compensation is kind of critical. It's critical intellectually because the case for correcting externalities, environmental problems, the basic claim is that we can fix environmental problems, externality problems, in such a way that everybody gains. So the idea is that everybody will gain. To do that, we have to think about compensating the people who lose as a direct consequence of the tax. So intellectually, it's clearly key to the argument. Morally, of course, it can be key to the argument because we might simply on distributional grounds want to make sure that the most vulnerable are protected. And it's also critical politically because if there are big losers, there's going to be resistance to the reform and it may not happen. So compensation, I think, is really key to this. In that context, as I just mentioned, technology, increasing financial inclusion are kind of a cause for optimism that we can do this in low-income countries much better than we used to be able to. For example, if you have a good identifier like the Aadhaar in India, if you can really have a good personal identifier, you can at least pay a kind of a poll subsidy. That is, you could in principle give everybody in the country, say, $30, whatever it is. And even with that instrument, you can achieve a lot in terms of compensating the very poorest. And I should say, compensating the very poorest clearly is going to reduce the revenue you gain from these measures, but net you're gaining because you're not compensating everybody. So there's still a net revenue gain. And even with the poll subsidy, the numbers work out that you can often compensate a good part of the population, maybe the bottom half, and still have a significant amount of money left over. When we look at, clearly there's always been a lot of interest in what works and what doesn't work in terms of reform. There are some striking examples which show that essentially extraordinary commitment is needed. And that's a kind of easy thing to say, but we're talking about senior politicians, presidents, prime ministers actually putting their careers on the line to make these things work. Strong communication, strong planning. Two examples we talk about in the book are the LPG subsidy reform in India, which I think became the largest cash transfer scheme in the world, about 140 million people. And what I particularly found interesting is in Iran, So Iran essentially had a huge fuel subsidy, and the way that they decided to get out of this was to essentially give everybody in the country a bank account, make sure everybody has a bank account, put about $30 or whatever it was in everybody's bank account once they'd done this, and essentially you couldn't get at this money until the fuel price went up. So the day that the fuel price goes up, everybody can get to their $30, $40, whatever it is in the bank account, which is kind of very credible, very direct compensation. And it seems to have been very successful. I was told that people actually then asked when the next subsidy reform was coming along. So there are ways to do it. But again, you know, this is really high-level politics, as well as the technical side. It's high-level politicians putting their careers on the line to make these things happen. There's an issue maybe to mention also about what's called earmarking. So earmarking means that we have a tax, but we say we are going to spend the proceeds of this tax on a specific thing. And so, of course, the environmental context, there's a temptation and some tendency to say we're going to put on this environmental tax, but really we don't want the money. What we're going to do, we're going to put the money into some kind of spending measure. It may be, for example, we're going to put the money into research and development to help the sector adjust or something like that. We're going to earmark, what's called earmark or hypothecate the money to a particular use in a way, essentially to try to get over political obstacles to the reform. Pure public finance people don't like that very much. They don't like it very much as a principle of earmarking, because either it's really overly constraining how much you're spending or the way you spend. So you may want to spend more on research and development in that sector than this tax will give you. You might want to spend less. And if the earmarking is not really constraining spending, then it's basically a lie. You're basically lying to people, and it's kind of lack of transparency. Public finance people traditionally don't like it, but I think there is a question as to whether people should be rather more open to that as being, in principle, not wholly attractive, but perhaps a political price that's worth paying at some points. Let me then kind of go on to talk about some of the more granular issues that come up. Just a moment. Well, we talk first about taxation of fuels, which is always a difficult issue and a contentious issue in all countries, including not least low-income countries. So I said that if we think about fossil fuels, the climate argument for heavy taxation in lower income countries is not kind of super strong. Really meaningful action on climate change requires the big emitters, which is a relatively small number of countries. The way we're going to make progress on global emissions is through the big emitters, not through the small emitters. Having said that, however, there will often be non-climate reasons why fuel prices and why some form of fuel taxation is going to be appropriate in low-income countries. And that comes from other environmental issues and problems they may have. An obvious one, for example, is air quality, which is kind of a local problem in the sense that it accrues within a city or kind of within a country. There may be kind of accident externalities. We know that traffic accidents are actually a huge problem in many low-income countries. There are better ways maybe of dealing with that through insurance measures and so on, but nonetheless, a fuel tax may help in terms of tending to limit the number of journeys. There are congestion externalities, which I'll come back to. That is, cities get very clogged with motor vehicles, which becomes a drain on time, a drain on productivity. And all these issues are nothing to do with climate change, but they can become arguments for fuel taxation. And in fact, when you do the numbers, they're often very big arguments, much bigger potentially than the climate change argument. So there's a strong case for heavy fuel taxation in many countries, even leaving the climate aside, which is why I say this is a kind of a self-interested argument. It's nothing to do with the kind of global commitment, but a strong argument for heavier fuel taxation to mitigate, to reduce these local damages. And as I mentioned here, in fact, economists, it's often sort of implied that the ideal approach to carbon pricing to deal with climate is to have a uniform price in all countries. Sometimes that's said to be the efficient way to deal with global mitigation. I think actually that's not quite right for reasons I've present in the book, I think there are quite strong arguments, even on efficiency grounds, that when you think about climate, you might want lower fuel taxes or lower carbon taxes in low-income countries than in higher. But in any case, that's rather different from my main argument here, which is that heavy fuel taxes are often justified in low-income countries by non-climate concerns. If we do think about carbon pricing, maybe a couple of points to make. Relates also to, of course, the fuel pricing. A couple of things always worth bearing in mind. The carbon pricing is largely about coal. Coal is the kind of the big problem when we think about carbon pricing. So again, that becomes a great source of difference across the countries we're talking about. Some use a lot of coal, some use virtually no coal. Also worth bearing in mind that people often think that carbon pricing the use of carbon in all forms is necessarily regressive. Worth bearing in mind that's not necessarily true in low-income countries because, of course, many of the poorest, for example, aren't connected to the electricity grid, don't have cars, all these kind of things. So again, just to keep in mind. Widespread informality, I just want to make the point that creates a strong case for taxing fuel, even if there were no environmental concerns. Why is that? Many of these countries, we have large sectors that are informal in the sense of not really compliant with the tax, their tax liabilities, could be legal, might be illegal. So they're really kind of out of the tax system. Taxing them on their inputs, notably of kind of energy inputs, can be useful simply as a kind of purely as a tax measure. So this kind of reinforces the idea that input tax, use of fuel, including as an input, has many attractions in low-income countries. Maybe I'll come back, or maybe I'll leave the oil gas issue. Gets rather complicated. But let me just say something about the last bullet point on this slide. So fossil fuels royalties are a form of carbon tax. What do I mean by that? Many oil-producing countries, including in low-income countries, have oil deposits which they tax, and one of the ways they tax them is through what's called royalties. Now, a royalty is a charge on the value or the volume of output. So it's a charge on essentially the number of barrels of oil or the value of the oil that's being extracted. That's a standard thing. It's called a royalty. But if you think about it another way, what is that? That's a tax. That's a tax per barrel of oil. Well, that's a carbon tax. So fuel royalties in low-income countries are a form of carbon tax, and that kind of, I think, is rarely recognized. And it does suggest to me that, for example, higher income countries might want to say, well, yes, actually, we're going to recognize that what you're doing is effectively imposing a carbon tax. We're going to give you some credit for that in terms of your mitigation commitment, for example. Or more generally, we're going to kind of, when we think about our own policy, we're going to recognize contribution you're making through the taxation of carbon at source. There are some technical differences, but I think this notion that low-income countries, oil producers, are already imposing a carbon tax is quite important. If I come on to other minerals, so of course climate action is not good news as far as it happens for many low-income countries, because they're just beginning to be oil producers, and if there is effective carbon pricing around the world, for example, the value of those oil deposits is going to go down. That is, they're going to have a kind of a stranded asset problem. So it's that again is quite a potentially significant issue for oil-producing countries. So if their oil revenue goes down, then that's a big hit to that overall revenue take. So oil side, the fossil fuel side, is a little bit of a depressing picture for low-income countries in that sense through the actions to mitigate global climate change. For many minerals, on the other hand, it's kind of good news, because many of the renewable energies, electric cars and so on, actually make heavy use of a number of minerals. They use kind of cobalt, lithium, copper. So as many low-income countries are already realizing, there's kind of there's potential additional revenue to be earned by taxing these sectors appropriately, which I think is which we talk about in the book, and that essentially means in that case relying not so much on royalties, but actually on what are called rent taxes. Rent taxes are essentially profit taxes based not on the kind of volume or value of sales, but on the profits actually earned, which in principle could be taxed at quite a high rate because these minerals are in limited supply. So again, from the tax side, there's a case for essentially tax reform to make more use of these rent taxes in low-income countries in relation to minerals. Forestry, of course, is an issue from the climate point of view, also a local problem in terms of erosion, changes in water flows and so on. Again, I think many people, that's an area where, again, you can think of having a rent tax, a tax on profit, but then also been a lot of work, I think, suggesting other forms of taxation that could be used to stem inappropriate deforestation. I think that's an area where it's clearly suitable for tax measures. The question is, I think, why they have been used rather more widely. Something to do, I think, also with governance and legal issues. Fishing problems in practice in low-income countries are not so amenable to tax-based solutions. We argue in the book. Really, if you think about where the money is in fishery for low-income countries, it's really in the kind of long-distance fleets that may pay to fish in the national waters. So Mauritania, for example, gets about 10% of its revenue from fishery rights, and maybe scope for more elsewhere. Very controversial in many countries, but I think it's in terms of when we think about revenue that might come from addressing environmental issues. Essentially, if you can sell the fishing rights in a way that preserves the stocks, that could be an important source of revenue. We talk in the book also about congestion pricing. Why that? Well, if you think about the megacities around the world in low-income countries, we know that the problems of congestion are actually massive in terms of people taking 1-2 hours of commute every day, impacts on productivity as well as local air quality. And we know that urbanization is going to increase rapidly. The number of megacities, population more than 10 million in sub-Saharan Africa, is going to go up from 3 to 9 in the next 20 years or so. And so what congestion pricing does is essentially charge for the use of roads, maybe according to the time of day. We know there are schemes, many of you will know there are schemes like this in London, Stockholm, elsewhere. Technologically, they're now not very difficult to do. Not going to be big revenue winners, but in terms of environmental gain, there's clearly large potential because it's not going to be the only issue. There are kind of wider issues of transport planning, road planning, mass transit and so on to relate to it. But I think clearly that's also another area, particularly, as I say, in the megacities where there's no reason why we shouldn't see more progress early on than we're seeing now. An area that I think is a prime candidate for a more aggressive tax-based approach is in the use of fertilizers and pesticides, which we know can be a huge problem and are a huge problem when you look back at that list of the environmental problems in the environmental performance index numbers. We know that's a large issue. It meets a number of the criteria that make it good for taxation. It's created in a relatively few number of locations. It's largely imported, so you can kind of taxing it is not that difficult. The problem more generally, it tends to be kind of underpricing of fertilizers. Fertilizer subsidies can be quite large in a number of countries. There is a kind of a warning here. That's something I passed over on an earlier screen, I think, which is that, for example, Sri Lanka, I think in 2021, all of a sudden went green by banning imported agrochemicals, which had rather disastrous effects on agricultural productivity. So clearly, we have to think carefully about accompanying measures when we're going to act more decisively on fertilizers, training, so on and so forth. But nonetheless, I think this is clearly an area where the absence of tax measures requires some explanation. In some sense, as a kind of technical point, one way you can tax something implicitly is by not getting a credit under the VAT. So you kind of do it in that indirect way, but really only insofar as people are paying the VAT. More generally, you're going to need an outright tax. If I come on, I think, to my final slide, just to make a few more of these points. In general, economists would say that the way to deal with adverse externalities, with environmental problems, is by taxing bad things. Now, in the theory, if you went back to that chart, you could actually deal with that problem by subsidizing a good thing. In a way, what you could do is you could kind of subsidize the person suffering the damage to accept the harm, or in other contexts, instead of taxing dirty production, some form of production that's dirty, you could subsidize some forms of production that is clean. Now, in general, you could do either of those things if you didn't care about revenue. But we do care about revenue. We care about revenue a lot in low-income countries. So I think we always have to kind of fight this temptation to say that we're going to deal with environmental problems by subsidizing renewable energy or whatever it is, subsidizing good things rather than by taxing harmful emissions. And that, I think, is a warning against the use of environmentally motivated tax incentives of various kinds. The wider context there is that many low-income countries, and high-income countries too, have a whole range of tax incentives for all kinds of things, for research and development, for locating in a particular region. And a lot of the experience is that these incentives, A, are expensive, B, don't really do anything, because it may be that the investment would have occurred anyway. So all you're doing is giving money to an activity that would have happened anyway. They can clearly give rise to governance problems if they're not controlled properly. So I think there is a kind of a risk, which we're not yet seeing quite so much, of far from the environmental problems leading to addressing environmental problems leading to additional revenue, they may lead to additional spending through these kind of tax incentives. So I think that's something that we'd be keen to avoid. So far, I think I'm a bit less clear, a bit less sure of this than I was when I wrote the book a while ago. That hasn't been so much of a problem yet. But I think more generally, if we look around the world, a lot of one big disappointment is precisely that many countries are adopting an approach, not, for example, of pricing carbon properly, but of going through large subsidy schemes on the renewables alternative energy side, which is in kind of public finance and other terms, possibly not the right way to go. The book talks to us about waste management because it is such a large problem for many low-income countries. There it is sort of slightly hard for now, at least, to see effective tax-based solutions in low-income countries. I think partly because of this local capacity issue. We do see some examples of voluntary cooperation in communities to deal with this. But really, I think ultimately what waste management is not going to be a source of revenue. It's again something there where we're going to have to raise more revenue in order to finance the local infrastructure, the local activities to deal with the problem. So this is an example of an environmental problem which, absent an obvious tax solution, we're going to be looking primarily at more spending. And this can be quite expensive. Building a proper landfill site and so on is not cheap. And so there are large estimates of the revenue needed for this. So again, this is pushing the challenge really back onto the general issue of increasing tax revenue more generally. I should say a little bit about adaptation, that is coming to terms with climate change. There, I think it's hard to see a role for tax policy because essentially this is so granular. Conceptually, you can imagine of having a tax related to seeds of a variety that were known not to be very drought resistant. But in practice, it's really hard to see how taxes could be designed to kind of support adaptation, to send price signals that would send adaptation to climate change in the right direction. So once again, this becomes a pricing or an issue for the spending side, that probably what we're going to need is spending to support the research into knowing whether this particular seed is more drought resistant or not. Talk also in the book about the topic we had a discussion of, as Trent reminded us here a while ago, on carbon border adjustment, where the issue is, well, so now the EU is going to impose essentially a carbon levy on imports that have not borne a carbon price equivalent to the one levied within the European Union. Certainly concerned about what that's going to mean for low-income countries in terms of their exports to the EU. I think views differ, but relatively few cases. There are a few, I think, steel production in Mozambique, for example, where this may become a big issue, but in itself, maybe not necessarily too damaging. You do see kind of different stories on that. But an interesting thing is, of course, that, well, if someone's putting a carbon border adjustment against you, you have an incentive to impose your own carbon tax on your exports, because then essentially the same total tax is paid on your exports, but you get the money, not the importing country. How far that will happen, or how far, as a consequence, this will incentivize countries to adopt carbon pricing more generally, I think is not clear. I mean, there have been suggestions that, well, maybe what the EU should be doing is, in one form or another, returning to low-income countries the revenue that it raises from the carbon border adjustment on what it imports for those countries. But again, I think that's still out there as a sub-theme in the political debate. So that kind of brings me to the end of the remarks. But again, I think maybe just to conclude by highlighting the point that, I think a few years ago, there was some hope that environmental problems and appropriate tax response to environmental problems would make a big contribution to meeting the revenue needs of low-income countries. I think that's really not at all clear. As I've seen, the big ticket items are worthwhile, but they're not huge items. And indeed, when you look at many of the environmental problems that are most serious, these kind of waste management, water quality, what you end up concluding is that actually what we're probably going to need is even more spending and even more revenue than perhaps we otherwise thought. So it puts the emphasis back on the wider challenge of domestic revenue mobilization. So with that, Trent, I will hand back to you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. That was really an excellent review, and really highlighted that there's quite a lot that can be done across different domains. I was especially encouraged by your view that it's becoming easier to ameliorate some of the political and equity issues that are associated with these taxes. So that's quite encouraging. Maybe we can talk about that more after. For now, I'd like to hand it over to Professor SAWADA Yasuyuki, who, as I mentioned earlier, is professor in the Faculty of Economics here at the University of Tokyo. He's also the director of the Center for Research and Education in Program Evaluation and the former chief economist at the Asian Development Bank. Amongst other things, Professor Yasuyuki's area of research expertise relates to development economics. So Yasuyuki Sensei, we're very much looking forward to hearing your comments on Dr. Keen's talk.
Thank you very much, Trent, for very warm introduction, and thanks for having me Tokyo College today to make some comments on really wonderful talk and a very comprehensive lecture by Mick today. I personally learned a lot, and although I don't have much to say, I 90% or 100% agree what Mick said, but I'd like to make a comments from a mostly Asian angle, using from broader issues of financing sustainability, achieving sustainability targets. And let me move on to my slides. First, I'd like to summarize on my own ways of take-home message from Mick's lecture. And first point is environmental challenge is, especially in developing countries, this is beyond climate change. We need to address water management, waste management, soil issues, and deforestation, traffic congestion, air quality, road safety, etc., etc. And we need to be aware developing countries face a disproportionate environmental risk, but at the same time, limited fiscal capacity to address them. So that's number one. And number two is why environmental taxes in this initial condition. Taxes seems to be a very, very efficient for managing pollution or negative externalities when damage clear, and we can make a well-defined framework. And also, taxes can provide a means to internalize environmental cost while generating a revenue for developing country government, which has a limited financial capacity. Third key message was there are unique considerations we need to make for developing countries, urgent need for additional revenue to achieve Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, and limited administrative capacity necessitates a simple tax design, which can be doable. Vulnerable populations nearly everywhere in developing countries, including peasant and small farmers or landless people. We need to place extra care and careful consideration. And also, many developing countries, status quo, provide subsidy for fuel or fertilizer. So there's a room for remove these subsidies and also properly tax these what Mick said about. So I think there is a unique consideration and there is a huge room for improvement in the context of developing countries. And also, fourth point is, of course, in reality, we need to put care on political and practical issues, effective compensation schemes. Now, digital payments and digital modality, biometric IDs connected to digital, compensation schemes possible. So these are very, very important when it comes to public political acceptance. And also lessons from successful reforms, that's very important. And Nick kindly mentioned about the very successful India's LPG subsidy reform. But the government needs to put a very strong political commitment and strong communication and credible compensation scheme. These are the key elements, and we can learn from these past successful cases. Number 5, somewhat granular insights we need to also sort out one by one. Fuel taxation is crucial. Again, taxing bats rather than taxing goods. Fuel taxation is critical for addressing local issues like air quality improvements and congestion. Forestry and fisheries, these sectors require pretty much nuanced approaches, combining of land taxes with royalties. So number 6, revenue and incentives, domestic revenue mobilization, domestic resource mobilization, DRM, is critical for environmental and economic progress. And a broader carbon adjustment, such as those in the EU, could incentivize offsetting export taxes in many developing countries. So in summary, my take-home message, environmental taxes can potentially offer a very strong and very robust solution to address both environmental challenges in developing countries on one hand, at the same time hitting another parts of expanding a physical space and achieving a fiscal objective to increase the tax revenue for social needs and development. In short, medium term and long term, achieving sustainable development goals. So this is a really very nice lecture, and I learned a lot. And this is a very important message we need to take home today from today's lecture. Having this said, I'd like to recap a few points by Mick in the context of Asia and using Asian data. First, Asia is now a good driver of a global economy and global economic growth. But admittedly, Asia took growth first and then clean up later strategy for this growth and development. And actually, as a result, we face in Asia lots of environmental, beyond the climate change, we have lots of environmental challenges, such as the deterioration of forest soil quality, freshwater system deterioration, urban health issues, and ocean health issues, air quality, and biodiversity challenges. So we face a wide variety of issues, and one notable aspect is narrow sense climate change. Actually, global greenhouse gas CO2 emissions, now Asia produces half of the global GHG emissions. And although this is a pre-COVID COVID data as of 2018, but this highlights how Asia achieved remarkable growth, but sacrificing environmental programs. But having this said, I think if we take this more positive, constructive way, this data, I think this data indicates that there's a huge room for improvement for Asia, and also using different type of instruments, including taxation. So let's look at tax. Actually, tax and tax revenue has been regarded as a very important instruments to address environmental and other pressing challenges. And broadly, domestic resource mobilization is top listed in many countries developing Asia. And this data shows the pre-COVID-19 situation, tax per GDP has been indeed increasing. So, you know, government not only became aware, but also started, you know, some tax reform initiatives. Of course, during COVID-19 pandemic, tax revenue declined. But I think seeing this increasing trend, and also the level of, you know, tax revenue GDP is really lower than OECD high-income countries. I think, again, there's a huge room for Asia to move forward and unleash the potential of taxation instruments and tax revenue. Zoom into environmental related tax. Actually, even environmental related tax domain resources are utilized, including fossil fuel taxes, fossil fuel royalties, as Nick mentions. These instruments have a long history, but often underutilized, especially in developing Asia and other developing contexts, developing economies. Carbon pricing mechanism, and here I listed carbon taxes data. Indeed, these carbon taxes increasing in popularity. However, you know, this revenue, Japan is somewhat higher among the Asian countries, but the tax rate way much lower than other European countries. So there is still there's a huge room for Asia, including Japan, to further expand the environmental related tax space. And effective design and implementation of these instruments can cost efficiently achieve environmental objectives. Again, tackling environmental objective at the same time can generate a significant revenue to the government to finance investment, necessary investment in sustainability related areas. So let's switch a gear and looking at the angle of necessary investment to achieve broader environmental issues or sustainability issues. So this chart shows the estimate made by UN SCAP in 2019, just COVID-19 pandemic outbreak. And this chart shows the how much developing Asia needs to invest in different areas, including clean energy, left, and poverty, health and education, some you know, sustainability related, directly or indirectly related infrastructure, and also even including a biodiversity domain. In total, 1.5 trillion annual, 1.5 trillion US dollars annually investment needed, which is around 4-5% original GDP. This amount of a huge investment developing Asia needs to invest in order to achieve ultimately sustainable development goal by 2030. But admittedly, government revenues declining during the COVID-19, and still expansion trend has been slow before the COVID-19 pandemic. I think a more important role in financing green and social investment from private sources. I think that's another important source of financing sustainability. And global pension fund, including Japan's GPIF insurance fund, these institutions hold a huge amount of asset, which can be potentially invested in sustainability area. Indeed, these assets started investing in so-called ESG arena. And green and social financing instruments designated or designed to promote the environmental and social goals can help compensate, rather slowly moving tax revenue. So my comment to Nick is how strengthening tax and also domestic resource mobilization, how that can be go in tandem with mobilization of asset resources through a private financial market, using instruments such as a social bond and sustainability bond. So this is what I thought ideal illustration. On one hand, private capital needs to be guided to finance SDG-related investment. So in order to do that, legal and regulatory framework should be rightly designed and set. For example, policymaker needs to develop and enforce common standards for information disclosure, impact measurement that align with the existing international standards. So greenwashing is really rampant, admittedly, in globally and also Asia. So how to set more transparent and international and global standards for this. And secondly, government can incorporate sustainability risk into their own other risk mitigation framework, micro and macro prudential framework. And also countries can help strengthen market infrastructure and ecosystem so that huge global assets, resources can flow into developing countries' local currency, particularly local currency capital market. So this is the left-hand side part. I'd like to ask Nick's opinion how that can go with the right-hand side, domestic resource mobilization, and also strengthening tax. And indeed, ADB started during the COVID-19 under leadership of President Masa Sakawa, who was the chair of OECD Tax Committee. He started during the COVID-19 Asia Pacific Tax Hub to strengthen international tax cooperation and also strengthen balance between tax revenues and promoting investment, in addition to making more transparent and efficient tax administration capacity. And then I think this is the final slide. So when it comes to the financing particular green objective, there are multiple instruments available. And this is one example. This paper, this table I took from the paper by Professor Naoki Yoshino of Keio University, former Dean of Asian Development Bank Institute, and his co-author. This paper examines the distribution of financial burdens and recipients of funds across various carbon finance instruments. Left end is a carbon credit rating. Carbon credit rating alone doesn't create any burden on private sector. However, they do not generate direct financial flows neither. And then second for the left is carbon tax, and carbon tax place a burden on private sector, and then funds collected by the government. So carbon tax is a scheme of a transfer from private entity to the government. And middle carbon pricing for example, cap and trade scheme, financial burden is initially shouldered by the private sector. However, unlike carbon taxes, the funds generally circulate within the private sector as a company, these are private entities trade emission allowances. So there is not much implication or room for systematically and continuously expand government tax revenue. And second on the right is a private green bond. So bond issued by private issuers, then that means private investors transfer funds to the bond issuers. And this creates a financial obligation for the issuer, but they also provide access to capital for green projects. And then finally, right end, but not least, public green bonds. So government issue a bond, like private ones, and then private investors' resources move to the government, allocated towards the government. And of course, government needs to make a repayment over the years, but this initial invested amount by a private investor, allowing a public sector to finance green initiatives through a market mechanism of bond market. So this comparison, I think, reveals the while all instruments ultimately place a financial burdens on the private sector, but they differ significantly in how funds are channeled and how government revenue, expanded or not expanded, depending on the different type of design. And I think next probably pointed out carbon tax has many important features if we compare other alternative ways of financing sustainable investment. But I'd like to invite Nick's comments on this broader perspective, how we should regard tax instruments and broader domestic resource mobilization programs to enhance overall financeability of sustainability investment. I stop here. But again, thank you very much for wonderful lecture. I really love it. Thank you. Thank you.
Would you like to respond?
Oh, yes, I'm happy to. No, thank you very much for the comments and the very kind remarks. I mean, I'm not an expert on the climate finance side of things by any means, but I suppose I'm a little bit skeptical in some sense of things that have some element of voluntariness or that aren't backed up by strong price signals. I mean, I remember long ago working at the work at the IMF with the World Bank on a paper that I think was called From Billions to Trillions, which was about climate finance and talked about blended finance. And as far as I can see, that hasn't really kind of got terribly far. I do think sometimes, which isn't to say we shouldn't keep going. I think in some cases, so I think that the tax can obviously help to set up the signals for some of this financing. I think some of these green bonds, I think, are sometimes almost like a form of earmarking. They're secured on future revenues from a carbon tax. So it's a kind of a different form of earmarking. Like you say, this is a green bond, and it's kind of green in the sense that we're going to finance it from the carbon price or carbon tax, which in a way is quite nice because that's a form of committing to the carbon tax. If you're really going to stick to that earmarking, then you better keep the carbon tax going. Otherwise, you're going to default and all that sort of thing. So I think there are some links on that side of things. I suppose when it comes to climate finance for developing countries, I think at the bottom of the day, at the end of the day, we have to just be thinking about outright transfers, grants, loans, whatever it is. That we don't necessarily have to, in terms of the intergovernmental stuff, we don't necessarily have to kind of dress it up in particular ways, which I think was part of the original intent back in whenever the commitment to the 100 billion a year was made. So I'm not at all expert, but I'm more confident in these sort of financing measures when you can see that there is some measure to give some reason why I would invest in a green bond on any criteria other than I would invest in any other bond. So I don't think we've seen voluntariness achieve. Well, I shouldn't say it hasn't achieved much, but it hasn't achieved anywhere near. We're so far off where we want to be that I don't think we put my necessarily my hope in that. Of course, I'd love to be wrong, but I think that would be my slightly ill-educated, instinctive gut response. But it's thank you for raising that. It is an important subject.
We actually have a question from the audience on a somewhat related question, which is for another mechanism for price of carbon trading. So the question is from Maki Sato, and she says, can you kindly elaborate more on the differences between tax and trading? Why is tax better than a market mechanism? For instance, because the use of market mechanisms, carbon pricing theoretically leads to the optimal price of carbon within the market. However, in the case of taxing, who decides what that optimal price of carbon will be and how can they justify it? And she understands that this issue might also apply in relation to fertilizers and pesticides.
Can I go back to can I share my screen again? Would be helpful. We go back to sorry to go back to this chart, but yeah, so it's a very, very good question, an important question. I mean, the first step would be to say tax and cap and trade can be essentially equivalent. So in this picture, for example, the idea was that I was imposing a tax of T, and then the level of emissions was being set at A, because the emissions were going to go up until the tax was better than exceeded the marginal gain from emitting more. You could achieve exactly, in that simple example, you could achieve exactly the same thing by saying, which I didn't have time right at the bottom here, would be to say, well, what I'm going to do is I'm not going to have a tax, but I'm going to set a total allowable amount of emissions of A, and I'm going to sell people the right to essentially emit if they buy this license. So you issue licenses up to the amount A, and then you basically auction them. So the question is, at what price will they sell? Well, they will sell at a price such that that quantity is exactly the one such the price the price will be such that people want to buy exactly that amount of quotas of emission rights. So the price will be where the T is here. So essentially, in that simple case, they'll be equivalent. In one case, you get the revenue as tax revenue. In the other case, you get it as selling emission rights. So step one is to say, in this simple case, they're equivalent. So why might they not be equivalent? There's a set of kind of political arguments. A sort of political arguments sort of say, well, actually, in practice, it seems that governments, when they sell emission rights, seem quite inclined to give some allowances for free. So for companies that are already established, that might have difficulty, they kind of tend to be open to giving free allowances. Some empirical evidence that's less the case under taxation. So maybe in revenue terms, you do better under cap and trade. Maybe the more fundamental issue is that fundamental difference is if I have a tax, I know what the tax will be. So I know that the tax will be T. I may not know what all these various curves are, but I know what the tax will be T. But I don't really know what the in a more complicated world than this, where I don't really know where these curves are. I don't really know where that blue curve is. I set a tax, but I don't know what the actual amount of emissions will be. On the other hand, if I simply issue quota emission cap and trade rights in the amount of A, what do I know? I know that emissions will be A, but I don't know what the price is that they're going to sell at. So imagine that we don't know where that blue line is. Tax, we know what the price will be. Cap and trade, we know what the quantity will be. So the question is, which do you care about most? And for example, if there is some risk that if emissions are too high, you're going to go to some tipping point, then clearly you want to do cap and trade. Because then you know what the quantity is and you can be sure you're not going to go over the tipping price. There are other cases in which actually goes the other way. You care more about what the you care more about what the price will be, depending on the patterns of adjustment. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I think it's this kind of ultimately this key issue of do you want to be certain about the volume of emissions, or do you want to be certain about the price? So many people would say that, for example, you might say, well, a good thing about Kyoto and the fact that we try to limit emissions in a kind of absolute amount, you might say, well, that's good because at least we know what emissions, in theory, we know what emissions will be and so on and so forth. But of course, you can change, if you have a tax, you can change it. So, if emissions turn out too high, you can raise the tax next period. So it's not clear cut which is better, except I would say in this case where you really want to avoid a kind of a tipping point, in which case I think there is a strong case for the cap and trade, as for example in fisheries. So auctions quite often used for fisheries, precisely because with fisheries you want to make sure you don't go over the kind of unsustainability point. So set the emission, set the total, and then let the price be whatever it is. At least you kind of guarantee and you don't go over the edge. So I don't know if it's the best idea, but it's certainly an important question.
We have one other question. I just remind the audience that you can submit your questions using the Q&A button on your screen. So the other question that we have is, the questioner asks, I've heard that women are more susceptible to environmental problems. How do environmental problems and women's or gender problems influence each other? Sure, if you have any comments on this?
Well, I would think of that as more on the kind of environment side than the gender side, than the tax side, where I'm more comfortable. I mean, it's certainly true. I believe it's true as an observation in around the world, that if you think about some of the kind of indoor pollution problems or the kind of waste management problems, those do largely fall on women. I think on the tax side, there are certainly, and the transfer side, I think there is certainly kind of increasing gender sensitivity, including, I think, on some of these transfer mechanisms. I think, for example, the LPG subsidy or the LPG scheme in India, I think went through some change to make sure that the benefit was received, or at least had a reasonable probability of being received by women. But I wouldn't claim much expertise on what I would take to be my comparative advantage, which would be on the kind of the fiscal implications. I think that probably comes up more on the transfer.
And this probably relates a little closer to my career
expertise
with the social sciences, where I guess there's a perspective that because of the gender division of labor within the household and within agriculture, especially in global South countries, often the effects of environmental harm fall on women more. So things like deforestation and loss of access to water can tend to affect women more. There's a really interesting paper by Bina Agarwal called The Gender and Environment Debate. It's about 30 years old now, but it's still quite relevant. So perhaps the question might like to look there. We don't have any more questions from the audience, so I might pose a question of my own, if I may, and asking this with the caveat that I'm not an economist, so I apologize if it's a little bit rusty in the way that it's worded. Okay, so we have the Trump administration is on its way in the United States, and they're promising to increase tariffs, raising the prospect of trade wars. If we do see a global increase in tariffs, is there a sense in which that sort of limits your room to maneuver when it comes to these kind of indirect taxes that you're proposing here in relation to environmental problems? Or in other words, is there a limit to the number of indirect taxes that can be imposed on an economy before it starts to create problems?
No, it's a good question. I think there are several aspects there. I mean, in some sense, you could say that, well, if we're going to have more tariffs, that's going to be more revenue. I think the Trump administration does see it as a significant source of revenue, amongst other things. in principle, that actually lets you to cut other taxes. It might be that you want to say, well, we're going to kind of reduce income tax in relation to the tariffs. So in terms of in some sense of the kind of the volume of overall taxation, I think many, we've seen very high tax ratios to GDP in a number of countries. We've seen, if you take some of the countries in Western Europe, we have 50% or thereabouts of GDP being taken in tax. The US, Japan are very far from that. So I think in terms of the general sense of is there room to raise more revenue, I think in many countries, if you really wanted to, probably there is. You could partly, if you wanted to, offset that, indeed by cutting other taxes. I'm not saying that would necessarily be a good thing, but in terms of what would be in principle possible, you could say, well, we're going to have tariffs, we're going to cut corporate taxes, whatever. And I guess one might argue, conventional people argue that's going to be good for growth. I think on the environmental side, as well as the kind of prospect of tariffs, I think we've already seen some degree of an element of protectionism in the move towards subsidizing domestic climate-friendly activities. We've seen it in the US. I think we're seeing it to some extent in Europe. So I think the protectionism can also come from kind of subsidizing domestic production. That I think in the environmental context may be more ultimately the concern, because that's really going down this route of saying we're going to subsidize what we think are good things, rather than maybe at the same time tax things that we think are bad. So I don't know if that gives anyone a answer.
Certainly complex times that we live in, that very encouraging to hear some of the different mechanisms that you've outlined that could be workable in this scenario.
Workable, I wouldn't want to say it would be good, but I mean, it's in some sense, that historically in the US, for example, was how governments financed 100 years ago. It's basically didn't have an income tax. Well, 100 years ago it did, but late 19th century, with no income tax, basically financed through tariffs.
See.
And a few others.
Can I make a
Please.
suggestion? Actually, when Trump administration started hiking tariffs against the China's export to the US in 2018, there are many technical papers started showing up what's the likely impact on China, US, and other Asian economies, and also other countries and economies around the globe. And many studies showing, the US overall losing by doing so, and also China also obviously lost the export revenue exporting to the US. However, China's export to US, for example, electronics products, that has been replaced by other Asian countries' exports, notably Vietnam. Also, apparel products used to export by China to the US, replaced by Bangladesh. So these countries actually gain a lot, and there are many studies, technical studies showing this. And by export-driven development, expansion of GDP, that's a good news for domestic resource mobilization, because tax revenue or tax base has been, continuously expand. So I think this is a very good news. And another issue is this kind of relocation has been done through foreign direct investment. Apparel case, global apparel brands started investing, already investing in Bangladesh, but even accelerated. Of course, we observed 10 years ago, Rana Plaza collapse, building occupied by government factories collapsed, and many female laborers were killed by this sad incident. But with this incident and also invested by global brands, actually now social safeguard and environmental safeguard, that's a top priority for a global buyer. So I think domestic resource mobilization and also addressing the environmental issue or broader social issue, I think this trend is a bit, we can be very, very positive. Although, you know, in spite of this upcoming China US trade tension. So I think we can be cautiously optimistic of current situation.
See. Okay, well, we're just about out of time, so perhaps we'll wrap things up. But Dr. King, Professor Yasuyuki, thank you very much for your time, and thank you all for joining us. Good to see you at one of our later seminars.
Thank you. Thank you.